Russia probe heats up as former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort is indicted. And Manafort not the only one in trouble. Another former advisor also indicted, and yet another pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about talks with the Russians. President Trump trying to deflect attention from him and pointing it at who else but Hillary Clinton and even James Comey. We'll look at his claims and separate fact from fiction. Then Meghan McCain will join us to talk about the Manafort indictment, the rift in the Republican Party, and a whole lot more. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this busy Monday. Now, the first charges from Special Counsel Robert Mueller, they were filed today as part of the ongoing investigation of Russian interference in the election. The two men indicted, former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort and deputy campaign manager Rick Gates. Paul Manafort, the former Trump campaign chairman, arrived at federal court for his first appearance following the indictment against him and his business associate and former Trump deputy campaign manager Rick Gates. The 31-page indictment, it represents the first charges filed against anyone by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. The 12 counts include conspiracy against the United States, false statements, and conspiracy to launder money. The indictment alleges that Manafort and Gates moved money through hidden bank accounts. In total, more than $75 million allegedly flowed through the offshore accounts. It's unclear whether today's charges have anything to do with the investigation into possible collusion with the Russians and the Trump campaign. This indictment does not mention President Trump, his campaign, or Russian meddling. Manafort has repeatedly denied collusion, including when he served as a Trump campaign chairman. Here he was in July.
Are there any ties between Mr. Trump, you or your campaign, and Putin and his regime?
No, there are not. It's absurd, and there's no basis to it.
Manafort was fired from his post as head of the campaign following revelations about financial ties to the Russian-backed government in Ukraine. Gates continued on with the campaign even after Manafort left as chairman, and Gates also served as deputy of the Presidential Inauguration Committee. And now, the president is weighing in on Twitter saying, quote, "Sorry, but this is years ago, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign. But why aren't crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus?" To put it mildly, it has been a busy day for former Trump campaign advisors. Yet another one in trouble with the law, and I'm talking about the man you see on your screen, George Papadopoulos. He pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about a conversation he had with a quote-unquote professor closely tied to the Russian government. The professor told Papadopoulos that Moscow had a whole lot of dirt on Hillary Clinton, but Papadopoulos told the feds the conversation didn't have any substance, and he also lied to the FBI about when he had contact with the Russians. And now he's fully cooperating with Mueller and his team. So a whole lot to unpack here. So let's bring in former federal prosecutor and good friend to the program, Roland Riopel. And Roland, let's start here. I know most people are talking about Manafort, but I want to start with the aforementioned Mr. Papadopoulos, because to me at least, that seemed far more significant, not just what they got him on, but also how willing he seems to be playing ball.
Richard, you're 100% right. The big story today is the Papadopoulos story. This is a gentleman who was arrested in July and who has been cooperating with the government for some period. It is unclear how long he's been cooperating with the government. It is unclear at this point whether he's been making tape recordings, whether he's exchanged emails with targets of the government's investigation. There's just a whole lot more to this story that has got to have people inside the Trump campaign very, very concerned.
And when we say false statements, that seems to certainly be a theme for the last 10 months, but specifically when it comes to questions with Russia, I can think of a couple people like Jr and Jared Kushner, who also gave misleading, if I'm going to be charitable, statements, if not false ones. Has a marker kind of been put down here for Bob Mueller that it's not going to start and stop with Mr. Papadopoulos?
Exactly correct, Richard. This is these indictments, among other things, are a clear signal that there are some members of the Trump inner circle that are essentially zombies now. Don Jr. and Jared have made false statements about contacts with Russia, false statements to investigators, and Mr. Mueller has now shown that he's going to treat these as all as felonies and you will be charged. The interesting question, Richard, is why didn't those charges come out today against Don Jr. and Jared? And I think the answer must be that Mr. Mueller believes he has much more, and he's working on that, and all the charges will be brought down against those defendants when they are ready. But those defendants must feel like zombies today.
Well, let's get to the early morning headline, because obviously Paul Manafort. And soon after, the president, what else? But he tweeted and he said, hey, sorry, but this is years ago, before Manafort was even part of the Trump campaign, seemingly to say this had nothing to do with the election. This is all beforehand. Say why you believe that's wishful thinking.
You know, it's clear that Manafort's connections with Russia were so close and so intense, and were going on, you know, some of these financial transactions are going on right in the middle of the campaign. I think it is a fair theory that Manafort was Moscow's man inside the Trump campaign, and he is being charged with all these money laundering transactions and the like to give him a chance to flip against whoever he can inside the Trump campaign. And also, don't forget there's Mr. Gates, Mr. Manafort's junior partner, charged with much of the same conduct, clearly an attempt to strong-arm him into flipping against Manafort and anyone else.
And there's enough flipping here to get us dizzy, but it could be that Manafort's own accountant, let alone his own attorney, they might have turned on their former client?
Yes. That's absolutely clear from the indictment against Manafort that the man's accountant and attorney have flipped on him. And I say that because if you read the indictment carefully, what it indicates is that his accountant filed false forms with the IRS, the falsehoods that were given to him by Manafort. Now, there's only one way the government can know the accountant is not in on the deal with Manafort. The accountant's been in there and talking to the government and has told him, Manafort lied to me, he caused me to file these false forms. And the same is true of the false FARA forms, F-A-R-A forms, filed by Manafort with the assistance of a lawyer. Clearly, the lawyer who filed those forms has gone into the government and said, hey, I didn't know there was anything wrong here. That's on Manafort. So he's got his own professionals have turned on him now. That's quite clear from the indictment.
And you mentioned the FARA forms because already there was a spokesman for Manafort who went out and said, hey, this has been used a handful of times in the last God knows how long. This is a reach by the government. Right. Speak to that, but also why one Mr. Flynn should be paying close attention to just how far Mueller went with Manafort and how it could apply to him too.
Oh, yes. Well, FARA violations are not often prosecuted. That is true. That doesn't mean that they can't be prosecuted or shouldn't be prosecuted in an appropriate case. In a case where there appears to be, as is the case here, some strong evidence of collusion between at least members of the Trump campaign and Russia, bringing a charge based on a FARA violation is far from a problem. I think that that's probably entirely appropriate. Now, Mr. Flynn is deader than a doornail on FARA violations because he has admitted that he did not file these forms in an appropriate and timely way. He went back and amended his forms, as did Mr. Manafort, and that amendment is now being used against Mr. Manafort as a weapon, as an admission by him that the form originally filed was false. The same will be done with Mr. Flynn. The question now on the table is, why wasn't Flynn charged with that now, if we have that in hand? Again, I think the answer is there's a whole lot more to come with respect to Mr. Flynn, and we'll have to wait and see what it is.
Clearly, Mr. Mueller is not a man you want to get on the wrong side of. But to that end, I'm going to ask you a question. Obviously, there's some political overtones, and I have no idea what Capitol Hill will do next. But Roland, what if the president decides and makes it very clear to the folks involved in this, hey, you know, I'll basically get out of jail free cards here. I'll pardon everybody and anybody that I want. And moreover, what if some of those bubbling threats of firing Mueller and stopping this investigation in its tracks actually become reality? It's not that crazy a concept after what we saw happened to Mr. Comey. Talk about those two scenarios and how you think it would play out.
Well, I think partly why Mueller has just brought the charges he's brought today is this is a test run, right? He is testing to see what will Trump's next move be. And if Trump exercises his power to pardon Manafort, Gates, and perhaps Papadopoulos, then we'll see what Congress's reaction to that would be. I would expect and I would hope that Congress's reaction to that would be to impeach Mr. Trump for it and remove him from office. But one can't tell. There's a lot of people in Congress who seem very afraid of the Trump base, and they may simply not have the courage to do that.
Roland Riopel, great job as always. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to speak to you, Richard.
Coming up next, everybody, we're going to try and separate a little rhetoric from reality. As indictments pile up, the White House still saying this has nothing to do with the president and everything to do with one Hillary Clinton. We're going to show you why it's simply not the case. Stay with us.